Greetings. In this video, you will hear the most interesting and scary 5 horror stories. If you like these stories, you can subscribe so you don't lose my channel. Enjoy watching. The 13th hour. It always started at 12:59 a.m. Ethan Shaw woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, staring at the glowing red digits of his alarm clock. 12:59, the same time, every night. His heart raced as if jolted from a nightmare he could never remember. But the real horror began when the clock struck 1 a.m. and never moved past it. At first, he thought it was a glitch, a broken clock. Simple enough. But his phone, his laptop, every digital display in his apartment showed the same thing. 1 a.m. Frozen. The world outside his window seemed equally still. No passing cars, no flickering streetlights, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. Until the knock on his door. It was faint at first, a soft, deliberate tapping. Ethan hesitated, the pit in his stomach growing colder with each echo. He lived alone. No visitors. No neighbors awake at this hour. When he finally mustered the courage to open the door, no one was there. But something was. A shadow lingered just beyond the hallway light. Not a person, not exactly. More like the absence of one. A figure-shaped void, darker than the darkness itself, standing motionless at the end of the corridor. Ethan blinked, and it was gone. He slammed the door shut. But when he turned around, the shadow was inside. Ethan screamed and woke up in his bed. 12:59 a.m. The loop had begun. No matter what Ethan did, whether he stayed awake, left his apartment, or even tried to end his own life, he always woke up at the same moment, the same cold sweat, the same racing heart. 12:59 a.m. Again and again, and the shadow was always waiting. It grew bolder with each loop, no longer hiding in the corners. Sometimes Ethan would find it standing at the foot of his bed, its featureless face just inches from his own. Sometimes it would mimic his movements, as if studying him. Other times, it would speak, not in words, in memories. His own voice, distorted, echoing back fragments of things he wished he could forget. Arguments with his father, the day his sister drowned while he stood frozen on the shore. Mistakes that carved scars deeper than any knife ever could. The shadow wasn't just stalking him. It knew him. Ethan tried everything. He left his apartment, sprinting into the frozen city where time had stopped. But the streets twisted unnaturally, looping back on themselves. No matter how far he ran, he always ended up back at his front door. He smashed clocks, destroyed his furniture, set his apartment on fire once, only to wake up again, perfectly intact, at 12:59 a.m. Until one night, he decided to face it. When the knock came, Ethan didn't hesitate. He opened the door and stepped outside, facing the shadow head-on. His voice trembled, but he forced the words out. "What do you want?" The shadow tilted its head. Then, in Ethan's own voice, it whispered, "You." And it lunged. Ethan woke up, but not in his bed. He was standing in the middle of an endless, gray void. No walls, no sky, just an infinite expanse of nothingness. The clock on his wrist read 1:01 a.m. Finally, time had moved, but he wasn't free. The shadow was still there. Only now, it wore his face. And Ethan realized the truth. He was never stuck in a loop. He was the loop. The man in the mirror. Jason Reed didn't believe in curses. He was a skeptic, a practical man grounded in facts, not ghost stories or urban legends. That's why, when he stumbled upon an antique mirror at a dusty flea market, he didn't hesitate to buy it. The old vendor had warned him with a crooked smile, "It's not broken, but it breaks things." Jason chuckled, paid the man, and carried the mirror home, thinking nothing of it. That was his first mistake, because the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a door. The first time it happened, Jason was brushing his teeth. He leaned over the sink, spat into the porcelain bowl, and when he looked up, his reflection didn't follow. It stayed frozen, staring back at him while he moved. He blinked. The reflection didn't. He stepped back. The reflection leaned forward. A chill crept up his spine. But just as suddenly as it had started, everything snapped back to normal. His reflection mimicked his every move again. Jason laughed it off, blaming stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, something felt wrong. The second time, it wasn't just a delayed reflection. Jason passed by the mirror on his way to bed and noticed himself already standing there, inside the glass, watching. His reflection smiled. Jason didn't. Panic surged through him, but when he turned on the lights, the reflection returned to normal. Still, sleep didn't come easy that night. He left the bedroom door slightly ajar, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching from the darkness. Because it was. The loop began the next day. Jason woke up to the same alarm blaring, the same sunlight streaming through the blinds, the same coffee spill on the counter. He thought nothing of it, until it happened again and again. Every day was Monday, September 14th. No matter what he did. At first, he tried small changes. Wore different clothes. Took different routes to work. But the day always reset. When he smashed his alarm clock, it was perfectly fine the next morning. When he quit his job in frustration, he woke up again at 7 a.m., dressed in his work uniform like nothing had happened. And every day, the man in the mirror grew closer. Jason spiraled into madness, testing the boundaries of his reality. He set fires, robbed stores, screamed at strangers in the streets. Nothing mattered. The loop reset it all. Except for him. The man in the mirror wasn't bound by the loop. His reflection changed with each passing cycle, subtle at first. A different tilt of the head. A wider grin. Eyes darker, emptier. Then, it started moving on its own, even when Jason was perfectly still. Eventually, the reflection stopped mimicking him altogether. It just watched. Desperation drove Jason to shatter the mirror. But when he swung the hammer, it never hit glass. It passed right through, as if the surface wasn't there anymore. His reflection reached out, grabbing his wrist. The cold touch sent icy needles shooting up his arm. He screamed, trying to pull away, but the reflection was stronger, impossibly strong. With one violent yank, the man in the mirror pulled Jason through the glass. Jason woke up. In his bed. The same alarm. The same sunlight. The same coffee spill. But when he looked in the mirror, he wasn't there. Someone else was. A version of him, going through the motions, oblivious to the fact that he was now trapped behind the glass, pounding silently, unseen. The loop continued. But not for him. For the other Jason. Because the man in the mirror needed a replacement. And Jason had filled the vacancy. The clockmaker's paradox. The town of Greyhaven didn't exist on any map. It was one of those small, forgotten places tucked between endless forests and winding roads, where time seemed to crawl slower than everywhere else. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just faded signs, cracked pavement, and the faint hum of cicadas in the summer heat. Evelyn Price wasn't supposed to be there. Her car had broken down on a lonely stretch of highway, forcing her to walk until she stumbled upon Greyhaven, a town that felt wrong the moment she arrived. The streets were eerily empty, the buildings perfectly preserved but lifeless, like a movie set waiting for actors who'd never show. And at the center of town stood the clockmaker's shop. Its display window was dusty, filled with dozens of old clocks, grandfather clocks, pocket watches, cuckoo clocks, all ticking in perfect, unnatural unison. But there was something strange about them. None of them showed the correct time. They were all stuck at 4:44 p.m. Evelyn's curiosity pulled her inside. The door creaked open with a soft chime. The shop smelled of oil, dust, and something metallic, like rust mixed with old blood. Rows of clocks lined the walls, their rhythmic ticking growing louder with each step she took. But no one was there. Or so she thought. Behind the counter stood an old man, hunched over a workbench. His back was to her, hands delicately adjusting the gears of a broken pocket watch. His fingers were thin and long, moving with mechanical precision. Before Evelyn could speak, he said without turning around, You're late. She froze. I I think I'm lost, she stammered. My car broke down. Can you help me? The old man finally turned. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, his eyes a milky gray, like they'd seen too much or nothing at all. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just stared. No one leaves Greyhaven, he whispered. Not until the clock is fixed. Evelyn's skin crawled. She fled the shop, heart pounding, but the town had changed. The streets twisted unnaturally, looping back on themselves. No matter which direction she ran, she always ended up back at the clockmaker's door. The sky grew darker, though her watch still read 4:44 p.m. Desperation set in. She tried breaking into houses, but they were empty, fully furnished, dinner plates set on tables, TVs frozen on static, as if the residents had simply vanished midlife. Then she saw them, figures standing motionless at the end of the street. Shadowy outlines, featureless faces, heads tilted slightly as if curious. They didn't move. Not at first. But every time she blinked, they were closer. Evelyn returned to the clockmaker's shop, her only refuge from the nightmare outside. The old man was still there, still working on the same pocket watch. What's happening? She cried. Why can't I leave? He didn't answer, just handed her the watch. The loop begins and ends with you, he whispered. Fix the clock, break the loop. Evelyn didn't understand, but with no other choice, she took the watch. The moment her fingers touched it, the world reset. She was back in her car, engine dead, stranded on the same stretch of highway. The sun hung low in the sky, 4:44 p.m. In the distance, she saw Greyhaven again, its outline blurry through the heat waves. She tried to drive in the opposite direction, but the road looped back. She screamed, punched the steering wheel, sobbed until her voice broke. But eventually, she walked. Back to Greyhaven, back to the clockmaker. She's still there, somewhere in that endless loop. Sometimes, travelers claim they've passed through a town that doesn't exist on any map. A town stuck at 4:44 p.m., with clocks that never move and shadows that watch from the corners. If you ever find yourself there, remember, don't take the watch. The elevator doesn't stop here anymore. At exactly 3:03 a.m., the elevator arrived. It wasn't supposed to. The building was empty, just security guard Mark Holloway, doing his usual graveyard shift in the lobby of the abandoned Dalka corporate tower, slated for demolition in a few weeks. 30 stories of hollow offices, dusty glass, and flickering emergency lights. Mark had worked there for years. He knew every creak, every hum of the failing power grid. And he knew the elevators had been shut down. Power cut. Wires disconnected. No maintenance. Yet here it was. An old, rusty elevator that hadn't worked in over a decade. Its cracked panel glowing dimly. The doors slid open with a reluctant hiss. Empty. But the display above flickered. -1. There was no basement in the building. Mark should have called someone. Should have walked away. But curiosity is louder than common sense. He stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the lights flickered, and the doors slammed shut with unnatural force. The panel buzzed, the floors ticking down past 1, 0-1, -2-3. Mark's stomach twisted with each drop, not from the movement, because there wasn't any. The sensation of falling was missing, as if the elevator wasn't moving at all, just the numbers changing. Finally, the elevator stopped. The display read -13. There was no sound, not even the mechanical hum elevators always have. Just silence. The doors opened. It wasn't a basement. It wasn't even part of the building. A long, dark corridor stretched beyond, lined with walls that breathed faintly, the texture pulsing like skin. Dim lights flickered overhead, though there were no bulbs, just small, shifting patches of bioluminescent glow. Mark stepped out. The elevator doors slammed shut behind him, disappearing into the wall. No seams. No trace it had ever been there. Panic gnawed at his mind, but his feet moved on their own. The corridor stretched endlessly, Yet somehow, every step felt like he was going in circles. Then he saw himself walking toward him. At first, Mark thought it was a reflection, until the other Mark smiled. A twisted, unfamiliar grin. His eyes were hollow, his skin stretched too tightly over his bones. Mark turned and ran, but every corner led him back to the same corridor. The same flickering lights, the same doppelganger. Closer each time. His radio crackled suddenly, a voice cutting through the static. "Mark, don't let it catch you." His own voice. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing beside a rusted door labeled exit. With trembling hands, he pulled it open, only to find the same elevator waiting. Its doors slid open. Inside was himself again. But this version was beaten, bruised, eyes wild with terror. The figure lunged, grabbing Mark by the collar, screaming, "Don't go back in." Mark shoved the figure away and stumbled into the elevator. The doors closed. He woke up, back at his security desk. The building was quiet. The monitors flickered softly, showing empty hallways. Had it been a dream? Then he looked at the time. 3:03 a.m. The elevator dinged behind him. The doors slid open, and Mark realized the truth. He was still in the loop, and he always would be. The day that never ends. It was supposed to be the best day of Tom Granger's life. July 19th. His wedding day. The sky was perfect. A flawless blue stretched over golden fields, the air warm but crisp, with just enough breeze to rustle the white ribbons tied to chairs outside the ceremony hall. Family and friends gathered, faces glowing with joy. Music played softly in the background. Tom stood at the altar, heart racing, not with nerves, but pure excitement. When he saw Lena, his fiancée, walking down the aisle in her simple, elegant dress, everything felt right, perfect. Then, just as the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," the sky tore open, not with thunder, but with silence. Tom blinked and found himself back in bed. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, the clock on the nightstand blinking 6:30 a.m. It was July 19th. Again. At first, Tom thought it was déjà vu. Everything was exactly the same. The smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, Lena humming softly as she adjusted her veil in front of the mirror. He brushed it off as stress, wedding jitters, until it happened again and again. No matter what Tom did, he woke up to July 19th at 6:30 a.m. He tried everything to break the pattern. Skipped the wedding, left the house, drove until the roads twisted unnaturally, leading him back to the ceremony hall. Even when he refused to get out of bed, the day reset. 6:30 a.m. The same sunlight, the same song on the radio, the same perfect sky. And every time the kiss approached, the silence returned, deafening, empty, like the universe itself holding its breath. Then things got worse. Tom began to notice glitches, small fractures in reality. People's faces blurred if he looked too long. Conversations looped mid-sentence. His reflection in the mirror sometimes smiled before he did. One morning, Lena's eyes were completely black, her smile too wide, too forced. Another morning, the sky outside wasn't blue. It was a vast, dark void, filled with shapes that shouldn't exist. And yet, the clock still read 6:30 a.m. Desperate, Tom confronted Lena. "What's happening to me?" he shouted, grabbing her by the shoulders. She tilted her head, smiling that same hollow smile. "You wanted this day to last forever," she whispered. "So it will." Her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was layered, an echo of something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. Tom stumbled back, realizing the truth. He wasn't reliving the day. He was trapped in it, a prison disguised as perfection. The next time he woke up, he didn't bother getting out of bed. The sunlight streamed in. The radio played the same song. 6:30 a.m. But this time, he saw something different. Standing in the corner of the room was a shadow, featureless but watching. It had always been there, hadn't it? Just out of sight. Why? Tom whispered. The shadow didn't answer. It didn't need to. Because deep down, Tom knew. Some days never end. And some prisons don't have walls.